I just finished painting this portrait using water mixable oils, so I thought I'd share some portrait painting tips with you guys. If you've been following my channel, you'll know that water mixable oils are my go-to painting medium, so I have quite a bit of experience using them and adapting traditional oil painting techniques to this wonderful medium. Some of the tips we'll cover in this video can also be applied to traditional oils, since the two mediums are so similar, but some are more specific to water mixable oil painting. We have a lot of ground to cover, so without further ado, let's dive in. I'll be using this photo of my friend for the portrait we'll be working on, so she gets a huge shout out for supplying me with beautiful references. The first thing I'm going to do is make a quick thumbnail in my sketchbook to work out the composition and value relationships. A thumbnail is a small, quick sketch that can be done in dry or wet media, and I just use a graphite pencil because it makes it very easy to make adjustments. Doing a thumbnail can help you see the bigger shapes and value zones that can make your painting more cohesive. It can also help you figure out the best way to place the figure on the canvas and see the flow of the gesture better. In this case, the thumbnail helped me break my painting down into 3 main value zones, and I realized that I wanted the area of the face and the neck to have a much lighter value than the rest of the painting, which will add dynamism and character to this piece and create a clear focal point. Like I said before, I'm using water mixable oils for this portrait, which I'm going to supplement with a few mediums. First of all, I'm going to make a water mixable lead white replacement. I use stand oil, fast drying medium and chalk to make a paste that I then mix 50-50 with titanium white, which changes its properties and makes it less opaque and easier to work with. In general, I recommend getting to know your tools before you start painting, and that includes the mediums. I'm currently working on a guide to water mixable mediums, by the way, which I'll link in this video once it's up. For now, feel free to check out my 2 videos on water mixable oils. In one of them, I talk about how they compare to traditional oils and the pros and cons of both, and in the other one, I answer some of the frequently asked questions about water mixable oils and compare the brands that I've tried out so far. One thing you need to know is that water mixable oils are oil paints. They just contain an emulsifier that makes them dilutable with water. This emulsifier actually evaporates as the oils cure, so once they're dry, they're practically indistinguishable from traditional oils. Here's my hot take. I think that some of the issues that are attributed to water mixable oils are actually endemic to the Winsor & Newton artisan line, which, as I've already pointed out before, are effectively a student-grade line. For this painting, I'm using professional-grade paints by Cobra, Holbein and Daniel Smith, and I don't have any issues with pigmentation or paint consistency. I'll talk about my palette more later, but for now let's move on to my next tip, which is that you should first establish the main proportions and the general outline of your composition. As you can see, I'm using my brush to help me get the proportions right, but I'm not exactly using the side size method. Rather, I'm using a method called comparative measurement, and I'm basically looking at 2 things. 1, how things relate to each other in size, and 2, at what angle the major lines of the figure are. I then apply these observations to my painting, constantly checking and adjusting as I'm building up the outline. The biggest mistake you can make when you paint a portrait is to mess up the proportions. If the underlying structure is off, no amount of detail will save the painting. That's why it's best to establish the main proportions early. Catching mistakes at this stage is much easier and saves you from having to fix them later when you've already invested time in details. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes, and fixing them as early as possible will save you a lot of frustration later on. You need to keep tabs on your proportions throughout the painting process, so try not to get too carried away with the details. I would often squint and step away from my work to get a good look at the bigger picture. Using a mirror or taking a photo of your painting and then reversing it also helps to make the proportional mistakes more obvious. This way you can keep everything in balance as the painting develops. My next tip is to emphasize the big shapes, and that includes not just the subject itself but also the negative spaces around it. Instead of getting caught up in the details too soon, focus on the overall silhouette and the large value zones that define the structure of your composition. This helps create a solid foundation and makes it easier to maintain good proportions. I usually pay attention to the major shapes of the head, torso, and limbs, but I also look at the spaces between them, called the negative spaces, which can be just as important. An example would be this triangle created by the bent arm of the figure, where we can see the back of the chair she's sitting in peek through. These gaps act like visual anchors, helping me spot mistakes in placement and proportion. Giving them clear shapes can make the gesture of the figure more distinct and interesting. Squinting at your reference can help you simplify complex forms into clear, bold shapes and keep the composition cohesive and united, even when you start building up the detail later on. Now, something that I need to point out is that at no point throughout this portrait do I use water to thin my paints. Despite the fact that water can be used as a solvent with water mixable oils, I try to avoid using it for anything other than cleaning my brushes. Adding too much water can break down the paint structure and make it look chalky and streaky when it dries. For the underpainting, I don't mix my paint with any additional mediums and apply it straight from the tube with a large horsehair brush to cover the entire canvas as quickly as possible and establish context early on. If you find that your paint has too much drag, I would recommend using a bit of specialized water mixable medium such as Cobra's 091 painting medium, which doesn't alter the drying time while improving the flow of the paint. Again, I find that many of the issues people attribute to water mixable oils, such as dull colors, patchy textures, or difficulties with blending, are often actually linked to overusing water during the painting process. Keeping water to a minimum not only preserves the paint's vibrancy, but also gives you better control over your brushwork, making the overall painting experience much smoother. You might have noticed that at this point I hardly work on any details or highlights. That's because when you paint a portrait, it's easier to start with the big picture and gradually work your way to the details, which applies not just to water mixable oils but to any painting medium. This means focusing on the larger shapes, values, and structures before getting caught up in refining facial features or other small details. I begin by blocking in large areas of color to establish the main forms and relationships, and this applies to the face as well. At this stage, I'm not worried about small details like eyelashes or individual strands of hair. The goal is to create a strong foundation where the proportions, value relationships, and composition are solid and work together in harmony. Once I'm happy with the overall structure, I start gradually refining the painting, carving out the smaller shapes, adjusting the edges, adding more precise color transitions, and developing the facial feature with more detail. I also work in layers instead of alla prima, so each layer is meant to create a strong foundation for the next one. Another tip for creating a strong foundation for your painting is to think about values as its backbone, because they are what holds the entire structure together. No matter how accurate your colors are, if the values are off, the portrait will also be off. Value refers to how light or dark something is, and it's at the very foundation of our visual perception, although we don't always realize it. That's also why I suggested doing a thumbnail before you start painting. This way you can zoom out and have a clear plan for how you can make your values more cohesive. As you saw, I like establishing context for my painting by covering the entire canvas as quickly as possible. I do that mainly to make sure that no value exists out of context, because context is everything when it comes to values. You've probably already seen some visual illusions where the same square of color will look lighter in one environment and darker in another environment. That's exactly what I mean when I talk about seeing values in context. Strong value relationships and distinct value zones will literally carry your portrait, even if you have a compressed value range. I recommend squinting when you look at your painting or your reference to simplify what you see and make main value zones stand out more clearly. Since we're starting to refine our painting a bit more now, I want to talk about how I approach painting the skin. When you're working on a portrait, it's important to remember that skin isn't just one uniform color, and there are warm and cool undertones to it, and some places tend to be lighter or darker than others. In particular, it helps to think of the face as not having a flat tone, but as being divided into certain color and value zones. Generally, the forehead tends to be lighter and slightly more cool and yellow due to the proximity of the skull bone. The mid-face area, that's the cheeks and the nose, is typically the warmest and often has more redness in it because of the increased blood flow. And the lower face, that's the chin and the jawline, will usually be grayer and darker compared to the rest of the face. The same applies to other parts of the body. For example, on our hands, the fingertips will be the reddest, while the knuckles and veiny parts will have gray nodes. Keeping these variations in mind will help you avoid painting skin that looks flat or unnatural and make your painting more lifelike. Instead of blending everything into one even tone, I focus on identifying these subtle nuances. I also keep an eye on how light affects these areas. For example, highlights often will have a cooler tint, while shadows may carry more warmer or neutral undertones depending on the lighting. Recognizing these subtle differences can make your portrait feel more vibrant and realistic, and pushing them can even make skin vibrate, like in the portraits of Gustav Klimt. Speaking of realistic skin tones, one more tip I have is not to use too much white when trying to lighten them. Although staying cautious with white applies to other parts of your painting as well. It's tempting to reach for white to brighten skin tones and create highlights, but adding too much can make your colors look chalky and unnatural. White also tends to cool down colors, which can be useful in certain areas like highlights on the forehead, but if overused, it can drain the life out of your portrait. The problem with titanium white is that it's a very strong pigment, which tends to overpower any other pigment it's mixed with. That's why I add my version of the Velasquez medium to titanium white to make it behave more like lead white, which is a lot less opaque and chalky. Another thing you can do is mix in other lighter pigments for your highlights, such as yellow ochre or Naples yellow, which will help you maintain the richness of colors while adjusting the value so the portrait stays vibrant and dimensional. Another extreme to avoid is using too much pure black in your portraits. While it might seem like the easiest way to create deep shadows, ivory black can make them look flat, muddy, or too cool in temperature. I personally avoid using ivory black because it has a very cool undertone that can drain the warmth from a portrait, and I naturally lean towards a warm, earthy palette anyway. Overusing black can diminish the vibrancy of your colors, especially when mixed with reds or yellows, turning them muddy instead of creating natural-looking darks. So instead, I prefer using a combination of Van Dyke Brown and raw umber to achieve rich, dark values without losing that natural warmth. This also adds depth to my paintings without creating harsh contrasts. For example, I used pure Van Dyke Brown for the dress, which made it warm but also translucent, thanks to the transparent quality of that paint. One of the most important tips when it comes to painting the eyes is to make them darker than you think they should be. The eye is set deep within the eye socket, which is usually in shadow because of the way it recedes into the skull. The whites of the eyes, called the sclera, are especially misleading because our brain is tricking us to see them as white, but in reality the sclera is rarely pure white and is actually pretty close to the value of the skin. If you paint it too light, it can make the eyes look bulging and unnatural. I'll usually start out by using the skin color and add a bit of gray into it, making sure to observe the shifts in temperature and value within the eye. The irises also tend to be darker than you'd expect, especially around the edges and under the upper eyelid. Balancing the values in the eyes will help you avoid having them look crazy or unrealistic, and a few well-placed shadows and highlights can really make them pop. Speaking of making things pop, it's important to think about where your focal point is and how you want to make your portrait interesting. As artists, we have the power to guide the viewer's eye, and the focal point is where you want it to go first. Everything else in the painting should support that. In portraits, this is often the eyes, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, I usually prefer to make the eyes stand out less in order to add to the mystery and atmosphere of the piece. However, I'm making this piece as a sample for my commissions page, so I want to make it more conventional looking than my original work. By the way, if you or someone you know is interested in getting a portrait done in this style, you can head to my Etsy to order a commission. There's currently a 25% sale on everything, but you can use my discount code PORTRAIT25 to get an extra 25% off on your commission. That means that until the end of this month, you can get a custom painting like this for under 200 euros. I'm making it really affordable right now in order to get the first few sales in, but in the future I'm likely going to increase my rates to make it more sustainable. One of the most effective ways to create harmonious looking portraits is to use a limited palette. As you saw at the beginning of this video, my typical portrait palette consists of a cool and a warm red, a couple of earthy yellows, one of which is transparent and the other is opaque, white, raw umber, and Van Dyke brown for the darkest accents. I would also add more colors if the painting calls for it, but these are enough for most purposes. This earthy palette keeps everything grounded, and since skin tones naturally fall within this range, nothing in this portrait will go outside of the gamut created by these pigments. I find that using a limited palette helps maintain color harmony naturally because all of the colors in the painting are connected through shared mixtures. It makes the colors feel unified without even trying, and it also simplifies the mixing process, making it easier to control values and temperature shifts without getting overwhelmed by too many options. That's why it's easier to control and harder to mess up. There's a ton of limited palette options out there, and this palette is just one of them, so I recommend to experiment and see what works best for your workflow and artistic taste. Another tip is to keep your shadows thin and translucent to create a sense of depth and luminosity in your portrait. Many artists also recommend avoiding to use white in the shadows, but keeping them thin and transparent is probably even more important. Thick, opaque shadows can make the painting look heavy and flat, and that's why I start by establishing the darks first and gradually build up my highlights to avoid using dark paint on top of light paint. This will help shadows feel like they are part of the form and not just sitting on top of it. Alright, my final tip is to not be afraid of experimenting and making mistakes, because that's how you actually improve as a painter. It's easy to get caught up in trying to make every brushstroke perfect, but the reality is that growth comes from trying new things, even if they don't always work out. For instance, when I was in the final stages of creating this painting, I thought I'd add more visual interest to the dress by adding more texture to it. And later that day, I went to a local museum and realized that keeping the dress flat would be better. So I came home, took my palette knife and scraped the thick paint off the dress. Mistakes aren't failures. They help us understand what works and what doesn't, as well as guiding us on the path to finding our own art style. So don't be afraid to mess up. It's part of the process, and every painting, successful or not, will teach you something new. So that's all the tips I have for now. Thank you for watching me paint this portrait, and feel free to go check out my Etsy or my website, where you can now order a portrait of you or your loved ones, just like this one, except those come painted on linen canvases, so they could be hung without a frame if needed. My original paintings and prints are also now available for purchase, and I'll add more of those to my store in the next few days. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions, and feel free to share your own portrait painting tips. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to this channel for more art shenanigans, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!